So, lots of good conversations there. I hope those conversations were with somebody you haven't met before. I managed to facilitate one introduction in the queue between Merseyside and Scotland, so as a start. I hope you guys managed to do something similar. Okay, so I'm really delighted to open this next session, which is a conversation between Therese Conway, who many of you know as the former CEO of Cavan Credit Union and currently the Chief Executive of Collaborative Finance, which is, we've already been referenced this morning about the Cultivate loan and some of the other initiatives that are going on at Collaborative Finance in Ireland. And Mairéad McGuiness, former EU Commissioner, long-time MEP, with a long-time interest and engagement with financial services and a personal interest in financial literacy. I'm not going to make any more introductions because they're going to get into that. But what Therese and Mairéad are going to talk a little, and then there will be an opportunity for you to ask a question. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Therese.
Thanks very much, Nick. Just want to say thank you very much to Nick for the invitation to the conference, and it's great to see such a crowd. And I'm not sure, maybe thank you to Declan Mooney for giving me this gig. My daughter said to me, "Why did they ask you?" And I said, "I think it's because I don't mind talking." And she gave me a look that said she didn't appreciate that as one of my best qualities. So hopefully it'll land a little bit better today. But I was never going to turn down the chance to speak to somebody of the calibre of Mairéad. And I was listening to some presentations and conversations she had been in before over the weekend and that, and the breadth and depth of your experience, your knowledge, the roles, highly impressive. Mairéad's former journalist, MEP for 16 years, EU Commissioner for Financial Services, Financial Stability and Capital Markets Union. And by all accounts, the best is yet to come. So thank you very much, Mairéad, for being here today. And I suppose my first question, and we are going to look at the wider view and regulation in general and your experiences in Europe, and we will bring them back at points to the credit union landscape. So my first question is your first encounters or experiences of the credit union.
I suppose, like a lot of people, the credit union was there. It was set up at the time my father would have been a young man. He was vaguely involved, but there were other people much more involved in RD Credit Union. And the natural place to go for your first loan for a car was the credit union. It just was a given. And you might have been given a few bobs so that you had enough to get the loan. So it was very local and very real. I have 4 children, and they would have come across the credit union through school and school quizzes and setting up an account. And then I suppose you drift into the banking system from credit unions. So I think I'm not sure why, and maybe it's something that you could talk about. The one thing I loved about the credit union at the time, they knew who you were, they knew your mother, they knew your father. There was that kind of very familiar. At the time, credit unions were set up in many places. You couldn't do the same thing again now. And because regulation requires all sorts of, and there are reasons for that too. And then I think the ethos of the credit union, the idea that you have something locally that pools resources locally and, you know, makes good use of them locally, is a very positive thing. I'm not sure many people get that anymore. I think in the early stages we understood that. I don't think that's the case today. Now, that's just on listening to people, because despite the fact that I do seem to talk a lot, I try and listen a bit more, and I think it's not such a bad idea. So I wonder why that is the case and why people drift. And then I'm kind of looking at the cohort of my children's generation, and frankly, it's the phone for everything, especially the 24-year-old. The others are older. And beneath that, so it's the gambling app, it's the whatever app, it's the other thing, maybe a crypto app. I mean, they all are engaging in practices at the click, literally, with no knowledge. And I think that's the piece that I would be more concerned about. And that's why when I took on the job of commission, I asked the services, you know, about financial literacy. And I suppose FISMA, which is the services that I would have worked with, were very focused on the industry and regulation and making sure, things were stable. But there was very little research on the financial well-being or the financial savvy, as I would call it, of citizens of Europe. And the research showed that there are big issues. Young people, women, but a lot of people have issues around finance. And it's the thing you use all the time, every day, and have to make big decisions on. And I think credit unions probably locally support people maybe in making the right decisions for them. And I talk to some people in credit unions who say, yeah, even for very small things, people will come in, which is a public good, and it's probably not paid for. And I'm quite passionate around financial literacy because it also affects your standing, it affects your mental health, your physical health. Those who have better finances just are physically better and won't suffer as much. So in one sense, it's the route to societal improvement. And I don't think that's taken on enough, even by the financial industry itself. And now there are a lot of initiatives, but I don't think it has resulted in joined up thinking around what's the best way to start at an early stage. So I was on a farm, so we would have sold strawberries and raspberries. So I handled cash, so I could count. And kept, so small things like that. I talked to some people today, grandparents, whose children don't handle cash, and they find that very difficult to understand. No, it isn't impossible in a digital world to understand money, but it is different. And I think the way we talk about it and deal with it has to be different as well.
I'm going to go straight in then to the next question, if you don't mind. Crypto, digital euro, and cash. How does that balance, I suppose, going forward? Where do you see, that the future is, and where you have to be careful?
That is a huge question. I suppose the first thing is, I was in Valencia recently in Spain for work, and the lights went out. And only those of us who had 50 euros could get a taxi to stop. You nearly had to wave it before they stopped. So cash is king. And I think we need cash for resilience. And I think that's becoming, we've actually realized that now, because we all tapped during COVID, thought we'd never go back, and now we are. But that requires cash to be available and acceptable. And one of the things we did before I left office was to make sure member states look at this issue of the availability of cash and its acceptability in retail and other places. But that is a cost as well, and it's borne more by the traditional banking system rather than the other players that are there. So that's on cash. On the digital euro, and progress is advancing on this, and it's a concept that's hard to explain because you can't touch it or feel it. But if you look at the fact that many of us would have credit cards, and they're American credit cards, they have a huge footprint in Europe. There is no pan-European payment system. That the belief is that a digital euro, well launched and taken up, can provide an alternative payment system. So you have the digital euro app, and you can use it instead of your credit card. And I think that's also an interesting one when it comes to resilience of Europe's financial system. Because in lots of areas like drugs and products, we've realized that we were very reliant on one supplier, and when things went wrong, everything went wrong. In energy, when Russia invaded Ukraine and prices went up, we discovered the need to, diversify and whatever. So I think it's around that piece, the digital euro, is quite interesting. I mean, on crypto, I think around young people, there's a huge interest in it. And because some people have made an awful lot of money, there's a feeling that you can make an awful lot of money. Now, we have a markets in crypto assets piece of legislation. Some bank or central banks would say it shouldn't have been called assets, crypto assets, because that has you believe that that's something of value. And it's a bit like the gambling apps I referenced. I think there's a similar attitude around crypto. So Europe legislated. When I was in the States for my last visit before leaving office, there was a push to regulate, but the current administration, as you know, they really are now, well, President Trump is very supportive of this, and nobody knows where that will lead, and nobody knows what are the financial stability issues around it as well. So I think there's huge uncertainty now because of crypto. It hasn't gone away. And even non-believers are beginning to wonder, should we be involved in this space? Should we advise people to get involved in that space? And I suppose if you can afford to lose, fine. But if you can't, it's a bit of a gamble, you know, and that landscape, I think, is more difficult now because of what's happening in the US. And also digital doesn't see borders. It also is a great place to launder money for illegal activity. And that means that you're having, you know, child abuse, pedophilia, abuse of everything with this dirty money, and it's washed into the system. So for policing and authorities, and we have a new anti-money laundering authority that went through while I was in office, these are huge issues to grapple with, because digitalization has moved at a pace which we've all just suddenly use it without really having sat down to understand the hows and whys. You can't really pull back from it. And now we're even talking about how do we prevent scams and how do we stop ourselves clicking on a link because you're distracted. So I think that maybe we need a bit more caution around the instant digitalization reaction that we all have, so that we understand there might be a consequence around it. But again, for younger people who kind of, you know, make quick decisions, you know, they're not going to think that way unless at some point somebody actually says, just think twice. You know, look at it and think twice, and if you feel it's worth the risk, maybe. But there isn't really knowledge behind that decision, you know, particularly around crypto, that things can go very badly wrong. And those who make it on the back of those who don't make it, frankly.
And you mentioned there young people, and George mentioned it in the earlier presentation. And I suppose credit unions, we're all working away today, and it's great to take a day out and look at the wider view and bigger view. And somebody with your level of knowledge and the work that you've done in regulation and at EU level, where do you see financial services, say in 5 years' time, or you know, where can you see them moving towards, or that? And I know Trump, you mentioned him there, and we saw an earlier slide and how quickly things are moving. I suppose people were probably more comfortable forecasting just a few months ago.
I mean, the big issue in Europe is how do we mobilise deposits for investment? How do we get people to think about making the money they've earned work for them rather than languishing in deposit accounts? And we've done a hopeless job on that because we actually haven't given people we haven't empowered people around money. So they leave things sitting. There's a huge need for investment in a whole range of topics, including digitalization and cybersecurity, renewable energy, you know, all of this stuff around sustainability. And there is money in Europe. There's money in credit unions. There's money in institutions that's not being put to work. So in the next 5 years, I mean, I'm not entirely confident that we're going to get there, but my successor, Commissioner Albuquerque, she really has a huge job to convince people, but also institutions, to look at how we mobilize money that is lying idle in bank accounts. And one of the things that's very strange, in all my time in Europe, nobody ever asked me, why can't I borrow money somewhere else in Europe? Because it's supposed to be a single market. So there isn't a single market for money. There isn't a single market for capital, which means that we have loads of good startups, innovators in Europe, but if they go to scale up, they go to the US. And that's not going to stop. And there are lots of stock exchanges across Europe that want to hold on to being the stock exchange. But you have to question whether that's possible, given the fact that money knows no borders and it will go, you know, to where it can earn. So I think there's lots of things that are uncertain. There will be a move towards this savings and investment union. On banking union, I don't know. This is where we're trying to again, it's the same side of the coin, just have a European system where it supports. Maybe what I should start with saying is that what is money for? What are banks for? What are credit unions for? It's to provide money so that at certain times of our lives or our business life, we have access to credit to do things. And it's very simple, but I think the industry is very complicated around what's its function. What are the services that are needed? What are the pricing of these services? And when you go in and you haven't engaged, if you haven't studied kind of business organization or accounting or something at second level, you're kind of not equipped to ask questions. And we would also find that a lot of people don't have the confidence, so they might have questions, but they're kind of afraid to ask them because they sound kind of too basic. And I think we need to encourage people to ask basic questions. So what and why, and because you'll get clear answers. And if you don't, keep asking them. So one of the things I tried to do, but I didn't succeed, we had a retail investment strategy, which I wanted to rule out or ban inducements. Now, in the end, I couldn't push that far because the pushback from the industry was massive. And a lot of these inducements are invisible and people don't ask, but they're very nice earners. But it's not right that we don't see them. I would also say to the retail investment strategy, it's still alive. If I were still there, I would kill it. The Commission tends not to kill proposals, but I would, because I think there comes a time where if something isn't going to add value and it only adds more complexity, then it's not serving the original objective. So to go back to your point around the next 5 years is very short. The one thing that none of us know is how will this uncertainty globally play out? How will conflicts globally, which are horrendous at the moment, play out, and what will that do to financial stability? For Europe, the big challenge is we will be asked to, I presume, fund the rebuilding of Ukraine and probably fund and support what's the consequences of the horrors in the Middle East. And there isn't a massive European budget, so how are member states going to react to that? And the other thing that, unfortunately, having to spend more money on defence. So I think at the micro level, for businesses and for consumers, if things go in a good direction, the Savings and Investment Union should be a very good thing. But it has to be combined with member states working very hard to encourage us all to ask basic questions. I do not think we should know the ins and outs of derivatives or all sorts of things, but we should probe. When you've been sold something that you don't get, it is no shame to say, I haven't a clue what that means, and I'd like you to explain it. And if they say, oh, we're not charging a commission, then you say, well, then how are you earning from selling me this product? What are you earning from selling me this product? Is it a one-off, or is it every year? And I know some people in the services who discovered when I started asking these basic questions, they looked at products they had and they hadn't realised they were paying an annual fee. And okay, if the annual fee is worth paying, but in most cases, it's not. And then lastly, around pensions, I suppose, there is a young generation which will need to think about pensions maybe more than some of us ever had to because of demographic changes. And they are really hungry for good advice. And I suppose they don't know where to go. The CCCP have great advice, but again, there's not joined up thinking on this. And then credit unions offer lots of advice as well. So that's where Europe will be. But the financial stability piece would be a worry for me. One of the biggest worries I have is around cybersecurity. I think a successful attack on the financial system where you can't access what you have in your account and you can't remember what you had in your account and nobody can retrieve it. Can you imagine the social unrest around that for governments, for society? And we're a hair's breadth away because the criminals are really good at, every step that the industry takes, there's another step. So it's a constant and it costs an awful lot of money to do that. So I suppose with digitalisation, no more than with cash can be stolen, but digitalisation can do it in many, many sneaky ways and can take everything. And I had one example of a bank, not an Irish bank, who came to me and said, look, we actually did have a really serious attack on our system and we discovered that all our protocols and how to deal with it were on the cloud, that they couldn't access. So it's a bit like the hole in the bucket here, that sometimes you need a bit of paper. And I think there's a bit of rethinking about the wonders of digitalisation, that it's all good, and pulling back to say, yes, but how resilient are we if things go slightly wrong or if they go in a really bad direction? And with geopolitics, there are really bad actors out there who can and will attack Europe's financial system, as they've done with the health system and other areas. So I think that is a high risk, and that can impact financial stability. Uncertainty is impacting investment, which also impacts returns. So I think uncertainty is the real problem. But for a lot of us who would be in credit unions, you don't think of that when you're going in for your loan. And I think that credit unions can focus on just empowerment and supporting people. And I've heard that you do that already, but that also has, as I said already, a cost.
Nick has given me a warning, and I might ask you for a very quick answer, and then I'm going to open it out to the floor. And it's on a very small topic, just ESG. So a quick answer on that, Mairéad, as to, I suppose, financial services and the green transition. And then if you want to put your thinking caps on, if you haven't already, we're going to open it out to the floor.
Well, if you haven't already noticed that the green agenda is not as visible as it was. So when, after the elections in 2019, I was still in the Parliament, it was the European Green Deal was going to solve everything, growth strategy, jobs, etc. And then lots of things happened in between, and now the big topic is competitiveness. So industry has pushed back on the ESG. What's happening in America is really impacting. It's not that people will pull away from it completely, but they mightn't have it on their website or they mightn't vocalize it. And then there is a need to say, but the problems we were trying to address around these issues haven't gone away, and are we going to abandon them altogether? So on climate targets, they're not abandoned, they're still there. But I would have a bit of a worry that if industry gets the idea, or businesses, that it's not important anymore, that we're going to be slower in reaching where we need to go. I would have to say that I think we complicated sustainable finance for everybody. But then when we were bringing the accounting rules, that was complicated as well. And the fact that we're introduced after a pandemic, a war, real uncertainty, companies who didn't move to take action are very pleased with the fact that now Europe is going to simplify or delay. But companies who actually move forward aren't as happy because they're doing it. And I probably think those companies will continue to do it. But you're going to hear less about it, which maybe I would be interested in what the audience thinks. Maybe there was too much ideology and less pragmatism when we talked ESG. And maybe we also needed to say, especially on climate and reaching those targets, that it sounded so easy, and it's not easy. Even the figures around Ireland's renewable energy production, and we are doing good things, but we're kind of running faster to stand still. And then there's the big issues of, people like and want to see this happening, but not in their area. And that's a whole question as well that I think needs a bit of leadership. Just to think in the round rather than, I suppose, in a straight line, which tends to be the process. So that was a very long answer to the ESG. But again, I think what's happening in the US around universities, around this topic, it gets more frightening every time I read a report that's happening there. And the US does influence thinking in boardrooms.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mairéad. There's a huge amount of information there. But just to open it out to the floor, if you have some questions for Mairéad, and I see hands going up straight away.
Thanks, Mairéad. Thanks, Therese. Martin Fisher from the Irish League of Credit Unions. Mairéad, I just had a question around the digital euro, and I suppose that concept and what potential impact that might have on credit unions, intended, unintended, or otherwise. And I suppose some thoughts about the kind of the holding limit there. I think it's maybe been suggested it's around €3,000, when I think the average savings within credit unions across the sector in the Republic of Ireland anyway is around 4,000.
Do you want to give a few questions? Yeah, actually, good idea. You've done this before, Mairéad. We'll take a few questions. Please, I think David
Hi, Mairéad. Dave McCauley from the North Credit Union, which, as every Irish credit union knows, is the oldest credit union in the country. There you go.
Never heard that before, Dave.
Mairéad, to your point there around ESG and the lack of pragmatism, I think that was a really interesting observation. As credit unions, we've been obviously the Greenify product is now a kind of a national product, and being organised through collaborative finance and being through the collaborative basis to offer. What we found, however, demand for products. People don't have that priority. Okay, so there's a huge education piece we're finding, and how some credit unions are willing to plug that gap is actually by involving themselves or actually setting up sustainable engineering communities, and we think there's a great prospect. But again, the funding and how these are going to be set up is basically through the credit union's own limited resources. So I suppose from the question will be, how would you see government, whether it's EU funding or national government, how can we get those funds into where it actually matters, into the communities? Because the avenues of local authorities or the avenues into individual groups composing of a number of key individuals, that simply hasn't worked in the past. Are credit unions, or could credit unions be the vehicle to actually apply the pragmatism, as you say, and get the money directly into those groups, into those communities on the ground, where we can actually impact the local initiatives to create the climate change in local communities?
Thanks, Dave. Any more? Are we? Yeah, we'll do. Michael, you're our third and last. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael Byrne from Core Credit Union. There's an initiative at a European level to reduce burden on businesses by 25% and I think 35% for small to medium enterprises. Do you think that goes far enough? And what can we do as credit unions to try and influence that we get more of a relief of the burden that we have to deal with on a daily basis?
Okay, I'll start with that one. I suppose a lot of what you can do is with the central bank, rather than at the European level. I mean, the figure of 25% is quite arbitrary in a way, but I think it was a signal that we have maybe with regulation after the financial crisis, perhaps the pendulum swung too far in that direction. So there's a normal kind of coming back. The danger is that some will see it as a way to deregulate. And one of the things I did in 2005, I chaired a committee of inquiry into the collapse of Equitable Life. And at the time, there was an element of deregulation in the mindsets, even in the Commission itself. So how do we get the balance right between what's necessary and what's extra and what's duplicated? Because a lot of things are duplicated. Now, every time I asked a business, because they'd say you're over-regulating in Brussels and that, and I'd say, well, you tell me exactly where. So I think the best way you can ensure that the credit unions benefit from the move towards less but more effective regulation, so less is more, is to explain very clearly exactly where you think that this is not necessary, and do it with a collective voice clearly. And start, obviously you've got access to government, you've got access to elected reps, because otherwise it's just a mantra of over-regulation. And I think there is a sense, Brussels gets blamed for a lot of it because it's very convenient, but a lot of regulation is homemade by the member states. And I think you need to find out, is this coming from Europe, or is it actually that they've implemented a directive where they didn't need to go that far, but they chose to gold-plate it? And that's across all sectors. So clear examination of, focus on 5 things maybe that you think could be done better and would get credit unions into an easier place. And I think sharing of data is one of them. And there is a proposal around data sharing so that you don't have to fill out, even if it's on screen, things like that. So I think that there definitely is a big push for it. And, I was over just recently, and this is why I noticed that there isn't talk about a Green Deal. There's talk about, reducing the burden of red tape and competitiveness for our businesses, trying to get money so that they can secure things for the future. So it's in your own hands. But I have yet to meet businesses who come back to me and said, actually, this is really these 3 areas. So I think sometimes people say without actually thinking. That's a terrible, cruel thing to say, because it's a venting. There's a lot of venting of anger, but there's very little then. This is precisely where I can tell you from a credit union point of view. And it's an opportunity, I think, for credit unions. So I would say get your heads together and come up with, maybe list a number of areas and then decide specifically to focus on them. On Dave's point, congratulations on being old. I'm getting there myself. it was a complicated question, so I'm going to try and cut it down. See, there is lots of money in the system. There's not a lack of money. We haven't just channeled it in the right direction, despite all our great brains. On things like green loans and houses, we are, if I note the figures, there is a lot more money being spent by householders in their homes. I think one of the things that happened very recently was the storm, and those who had really gone for a green home, secure, etc., found themselves kind of cut off completely. So I think that's caused a bit of a glitch in the system. But I don't think it should stop the advance of people trying to make home improvements. Whether they're all around climate or whatever, I'm not sure. And I think that probably less so now because people are worried about the cost of living. Because the cost of living has increased, even though inflation is down. So there's a lot of other pressures on people. And maybe they see that, well, I'll do that when I have time. I'll retrofit. Because when you start one thing, and I could do with a retrofit, you actually go into very big, and you can't go, well, actually, I'll just change that window because it's leaky. And maybe we should say, well, do those things, rather than the whole big, scary bit of retrofit. But I think the idea that funds aren't there, there is money there, and it just is not being used effectively. And I think that's something maybe to look at. I mean, on the digital euro, the banks were kind of very, I think, nervous of this because they thought they would lose out. So I think the proposal is that you don't kind of disadvantage financial service providers, but that we do look to the future, that Europe does need another payment system. There was an attempt to create one that didn't work. And I think there's more pressure now because the US we're still using the systems, but maybe more resilience is needed in that. I'm not familiar with the latest on holding limits, but this is talked about, and maybe again it's to put in that feedback around the figures you mentioned and what the digital euro is working out at. I think there's still a lot of uncertainty around it, even within the financial system itself, as to what are the benefits for me. The status quo is always what's protected because that's what people know, and they don't like to think that something will come along to change anything because they reckon it's going to be negative for them. And I think even for people who say, well, I have money in my bank account or my app, why do I need a digital euro? But equally then, why do you need a credit card if you're paying it off all the time? So I think it's about bigger issues around Europe's resilience, moving towards a savings and investment union, digitalising the euro, while at the same time having the balance around cash. And I think it will get there, and I understand from the finance ministers that they are making good progress on it. But everything in Europe takes a little bit of time, and maybe on the digital euro it's no harm to have that time so that it can be explained better. And that people can ask relevant questions like the questions that you ask. But if you want me to give you more detail on that, maybe I can kind of do that separate because I don't have the latest paper around where the digital euro is. I mean, so all of those questions point to the fact of change. But in one sense, some of it points to the fact that we're going back a little as well. So this idea of the pendulum, I think it's not in the interests of credit unions to see deregulation as the way out because it didn't work. And when the problem hit, it was taxpayers had to pay up. But there is an element of some of our legislation doesn't sit well with other pieces. So a bit of policy coordination is required. So I think the main driver of the push against ESG was around sustainability reporting, coupled with this due diligence directive. And together they were an awful lot for business to take on board. So I hope we don't lose the baby with the bathwater on this. But certainly I think there is much more pragmatism now in Europe around this. And you should use the opportunity when there is a mood for getting rid of stuff that's not necessary and for sharing data to get your voices heard. And I'm sure you've done that already.
Thank you, Mairéad. Huge number of insights there. As I say, the breadth and depth of your knowledge is, it was great that you could share it with us today. Really appreciate it. So I'd just like maybe for you all to just give a thank you to Mairéad.
Thanks. Thanks to Therese and Mairéad. That's fantastic. There's so much in there for credit unions to be thinking about. How's this going to impact on them and their organisations? How do we see that world panning out for us? But I guess also the need for support from and challenge in a way to the representative bodies, how to work through this. There's a lot in there, a lot of complexity, and the representative bodies can be incredibly helpful for us trying to coordinate our thinking and response to all of that. So thank you very much.